Here's something that should be impossible. A nomadic people with no cities, no navy, no stone fortresses, and no written military doctrine brought the most powerful empire in northern China to its knees. Not in a decade, not after generations of war. In 4 years. The Jin Dynasty had everything a medieval superpower could want. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, engineers who could build and destroy walls, a capital so fortified it made other cities look like villages, and a centuries-old playbook for keeping the steppe tribes right where they wanted them, divided, weak, and bowing. They had one problem. The tribes weren't divided anymore, and the man who united them wasn't bowing to anyone. What you're about to watch isn't the story of a lucky raid or a fortunate ambush. It's the story of how one of history's greatest military minds systematically dismantled a civilization that was specifically designed to stop him, and what he learned in the process that made everything that followed possible. Stay until the end, because the fall of Zhongdu in 1215 is not the end of this story. It's barely the beginning. Let's be honest about something most history videos skip over. The Jin Dynasty was formidable. Not formidable for its time. Formidable by any measure. Founded in 1115 by the Jurchen people, a warrior culture from Manchuria, the Jin had already done what most empires only dream of. They had swept south and shattered the Song dynasty's control of northern China. They ruled a territory stretching from modern-day Beijing deep into Manchuria, across Inner Mongolia, and over one of the most densely populated agricultural regions on Earth. Their capital, Zhongdu, where Beijing stands today, was a city of staggering scale. High walls, deep moats, granaries that could survive years of siege, a garrison hardened by a culture that had been fighting for a century. And here's the part that often gets overlooked. The Jin weren't just militarily powerful, they were strategically sophisticated. For decades, they had managed the Mongol steppe not through brute force alone, but through careful manipulation. They funded rival tribes, they played clans against each other. When one group grew too strong, Jin gold and Jin weapons flowed to their enemies. They had turned division itself into a weapon. It had worked brilliantly, until a boy named Temujin survived everything they threw at him, and started doing to the steppe what the Jin had always feared most: unifying it. By 1206, Temujin was no longer a name the Jin could afford to dismiss. He had united the Mongol tribes under a single banner at a great assembly on the banks of the Onan River. There, they gave him a title the world would never forget: Genghis Khan, universal ruler. What he had built was unlike any steppe force that had come before. This wasn't a loose confederation of tribes that would scatter after a season's raiding. It was a disciplined military machine built on loyalty, meritocracy, and a command structure that could execute complex operations across hundreds of miles simultaneously. The Jin noticed they were not comfortable. According to historical sources, tensions came to a head when a Jin envoy traveled north, presumably expecting the traditional ritual. The new ruler of the steppe acknowledging Jin supremacy. What they got instead became legendary. Genghis Khan turned his horse toward the south and spat. Whether the story is perfectly accurate matters less than what it tells us about the dynamic. The old relationship, Mongol chief as vassal, Jin emperor as patron, was finished. War wasn't coming. It had already begun. When Mongol forces crossed into Jin territory in the spring of 1211, the Jin military commanders probably expected something familiar. A raid. A large one, certainly. Dangerous, but manageable. The playbook was old. Let them plunder the frontier, bleed them at the mountain passes, wait for winter to bite, then watch them retreat north. It had worked before. The wall would slow them, the terrain would humble them, and eventually the steppe would call them home. Every assumption was wrong. What Genghis had planned was not a raid. It was a systematic campaign designed to destroy the Jin's ability to respond. He divided his forces into multiple columns, a move that immediately created a problem the Jin had never faced at this scale. Where do you concentrate your defense when the enemy is everywhere at once? You can't reinforce a mountain pass if 3 other mountain passes are already burning. Instead of crashing into Jin fortifications head-on, the Mongols attacked something more important than walls. They attacked the logic of the Jin defense. Supply lines severed, isolated garrisons overwhelmed before reinforcements could arrive. The Jin army, built for set-piece battle, for the kind of war it knew, was forced to react. To chase, to guess, and then in the mountains north of the Jin heartland, the Jin made their stand. The Jin commanders chose their ground carefully. Mountain terrain, narrow passes, forested slopes where Mongol cavalry, the most feared force on the open steppe, would lose its greatest advantage: speed. They assembled an enormous force. Estimates vary, but we're talking about an army numbered in the hundreds of thousands by some accounts. This was not a border skirmish. This was the Jin Dynasty throwing its full military weight at the problem. The logic was sound. The outcome was catastrophe. What the Jin commanders had not fully accounted for was Mongol intelligence, not just spies, though those mattered, but an institutional obsession with understanding terrain, weather, and enemy psychology before committing to battle. The Mongols understood that mountain terrain cuts both ways. Yes, it limits cavalry, but it also limits communication. It creates blind spots. It makes coordination between large formations slow and fragile. The Mongols used all of it. They probed, they feinted, they split Jin attention across multiple fronts until the massive Jin army, which should have been its greatest strength, became a liability too large and too slow to respond to what was hitting it. When the coordinated assault came, it didn't look like the frontal charge the Jin had prepared for. It looked like everything, everywhere, at once. Jin formations broke. Units that couldn't see each other couldn't support each other. Panic, once it starts in a large army, is almost impossible to stop. The road south was open, and something more valuable than territory had been won. The idea that Jin armies could not be beaten in their own mountains, gone. Forever. This is where we need to correct a popular misconception, because understanding it is key to understanding how Genghis Khan actually broke through. The Great Wall was not a single wall. It was a system. Layered fortifications, watchtowers with signal fires, interconnected garrisons designed to alert, delay, and channel an invading force into kill zones where defenders had every advantage. It was, in theory, an extraordinary piece of strategic engineering. But systems have a fundamental vulnerability that a single solid wall does not. They depend on every part working. After Yehuling, the northern sections of the wall's garrison network were compromised. Some defenders had died in the battle, others had retreated. Some forts found themselves suddenly isolated, no reinforcements coming, no signals answered. The Mongols didn't smash through the wall in some cinematic frontal assault. They found the gaps. They overwhelmed the isolated. They moved through the system like water finding cracks in stone, and in several documented cases, they simply paid or terrified defenders into stepping aside. The wall didn't fall. It failed from within. And once Mongol forces were south of it, the nature of the war changed entirely. From 1212 through 1214, the Mongols did something the Jin had no defense against. They made northern China ungovernable. Entire agricultural regions burned. Cities that refused to surrender faced systematic destruction designed not just to punish but to depopulate, to strip the Jin of the tax base, the food supply, and the manpower that kept their empire functioning. Jin counterattacks came. Some were fierce, but their conventional formations, designed for a kind of warfare that Mongol armies simply refused to fight, found themselves hitting nothing and being hit everywhere. But here's the detail that separates this campaign from every other steppe invasion in history. Genghis Khan was taking notes. He watched his armies struggle against fortified cities, thick walls, defended gates, supplies that could last for years. And instead of simply burning the countryside and calling it victory, he did something that no previous steppe conqueror had done at this scale. He recruited the engineers. Captured Chinese and Khitan siege specialists were not just taken prisoner, they were integrated. They taught the Mongols how to build and use catapults, traction trebuchets, and battering equipment. They explained how to cut off water supplies, how to read defensive weak points, how to use fire at scale against stone and timber fortifications. The general who arrived at the gates of Zhongdu in 1215 was not the same general who had crossed the wall in 1211. He was something more dangerous, a fast army that had learned to be patient. By 1214, the Jin emperor was staring at catastrophe. The countryside was devastated. Refugees had overwhelmed Zhongdu. Supply chains that once fed millions were broken, and the army that was supposed to stop all of this had proven again and again that it couldn't. So he negotiated. Genghis Khan received tribute, silk, gold, horses, princesses of the Jin imperial family, a payment so significant that it represented, in practical terms, the Jin acknowledging defeat. Genghis accepted. He withdrew north. For a moment, a brief, strange moment, it looked like peace. Then the Jin court made the decision that ended any possibility of it. They moved their capital south, from Zhongdu to Kaifeng. To modern eyes, this might look like strategic prudence, move the government out of reach while rebuilding military strength. To Genghis Khan, it meant something entirely different. It meant the Jin no longer believed they could hold the north. It meant the tribute had been stalling. It meant they were preparing to continue the war from a safer position. Weakness, deception, betrayal. The Mongol army turned south again. By 1214, Genghis Khan had done the impossible. He had crossed the Great Wall, shattered the Jin's greatest army in the mountains, burned the northern countryside into submission, and turned a nomadic cavalry force into something the ancient world had never anticipated, an army that could learn. And now, with the Jin emperor sending gold, silk, and princesses to his tent, it looked like it was over. It wasn't, because the Jin court was about to make a single decision, one move born from desperation, that would transform an uneasy peace into something far more devastating than the war that came before it. They thought moving their capital south was survival. Genghis Khan saw it as something else entirely. And what he did next would make everything you just watched look like a warm-up. Part 2 is coming. The siege of Zhongdu, the walls that were never supposed to fall, and the moment that changed the balance of power in East Asia forever. If you want to know how it ends, and trust me you do, make sure you're subscribed, because the next chapter is where things get truly brutal.